The music was soft, elegant, expensive. I stood just inside the ballroom, my heels sinking slightly into the thick ivory carpet, watching as the crowd turned one by one to look. But not at me, at the man whose hand was resting gently on the small of my back. Elara hadn't seen me yet. Not fully. She was too busy laughing, glowing, posing, everything she'd ever wanted on display, beneath those floating crystal chandeliers, until her eyes met mine, and then drifted to the man beside me. Her smile didn't vanish. It fractured, like glass cracking under pressure. She recovered, of course. Elara always did. But I saw it, that moment of terror, of recognition, because standing beside me wasn't just my date. It was the man she couldn't manipulate, the one who'd walked away from her lies 6 years ago, and never looked back. She stole my husband, and I never once asked for him back. But she couldn't bear to see the man she once lost choose me. Funny, isn't it? 5 years ago, she looked me in the eye, lipstick smeared from kissing the same man who had just held my hand at dinner, and said, "It just happened." And I believed her. For one stupid, devastating moment, I believed it was a mistake, that she didn't mean to sleep with my husband, that I was being dramatic. I lost a marriage, a home, a future, but that night I also lost the last illusion I ever had about friendship, about loyalty, about what love should look like. So I vanished. No Facebook updates, no new me Instagram captions, no public crying. I simply disappeared. Until tonight. Tonight I came back, not to make a scene, not to reclaim anything, just to show her she didn't win, not then, not now. And when she walked toward me, arms open, voice falsely sweet, with practiced southern charm, I let her speak first. "Juliette." "Oh my God, you came." I just smiled. Of course I did. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Because I wasn't there to confront her. I was there to let her see exactly who I'd become, and who stood beside me. Would you have done the same, or would you have walked away without ever letting her see? Where are you listening from, and has someone ever called you sister, right before they replaced you? Share your story. The morning I left Charleston, the air was thick with late summer heat, and the cicadas screamed like they knew I wasn't coming back. I didn't pack everything just enough to start over. Clothes, a few books, my grandmother's sapphire earrings I'd nearly forgotten in the back of my jewelry drawer. I didn't take the wedding album. I didn't take the dinner set we'd picked out together at the boutique on King Street. Let Elara have it, I thought. She already had everything else. I left a note on the kitchen counter unsigned. Caleb wouldn't miss me. He was too busy making breakfast for her now. I imagined her standing barefoot in our kitchen, wearing one of my old t-shirts, laughing like she owned the place. Maybe she did. There was no announcement, no farewell drinks, no final word to our friends. Because they weren't really mine anymore. After the divorce, only 2 people reached out. One did it to say, "I hope you're okay," and the other just wanted to know if the rumors were true. I didn't reply to either. I found Savannah by accident. I wasn't running to anything. I just needed a place that didn't echo with Caleb's voice or Elara's perfume. Somewhere with streets I hadn't walked in heels, beside a man who would later forget my middle name. The carriage house I rented was small, but solid, tucked behind a bookstore, with chipped shutters and a jasmine vine that curled up the back wall. The landlord was a retired professor who never asked questions and left fresh lemons on my stoop every Saturday. It was the kind of place where no one cared who you had been, only who you chose to be now. I chose quiet. I chose invisibility. I chose to become the woman no one recognized on purpose. For the first 6 months, I worked temp jobs, admin support, phone triage, editing grant proposals for nonprofits, anything that kept me occupied without requiring me to talk about myself. Nights were harder. The silence in the house didn't echo, it pulsed. I learned to fall asleep with the TV on low, not because I was scared, but because silence reminded me of how loud betrayal had been. One night, I dreamt I was back in my old apartment, except everything was rearranged. My books were gone. Her shoes were in the closet. My dog, who died before the divorce, was wagging his tail. For Elara, not me. I woke up sweating, heart racing, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me. That was the night I applied for the trauma recovery job. I figured if I couldn't fix myself yet, I could at least help someone else try. Chung 2. Set up Fan 2, 3502. The nonprofit that hired me was called the Haven Line, tucked inside a modest brick building near Forsyth Park. No fancy logo, no splashy mission statement, just quiet rooms with warm lighting and women who spoke in half sentences until they didn't have to anymore. I became one of the senior case consultants within 6 months, not because I was the most experienced, but because I could sit in silence with someone and not flinch. It was there I learned the language of survival without performance. The way women said, "I'm fine," while folding tissue into perfect squares. The way they avoided mirrors. The way they never sat with their backs to the door. These things I understood, but I didn't tell them I'd been left for someone who toasted with my wine glasses and slept on sheets I'd chosen. I didn't say that I too used to shrink myself to make space for someone else's chaos. That I once believed marriage meant endurance even through humiliation. Instead, I listened. And on weekends, I wrote. Not poetry, not essays, just long, bitter letters I never sent. To Caleb, to Elara, to myself. I burned some, deleted most. But they helped me excavate the pieces of who I used to be. The girl who had boundaries, who trusted without double-checking. Still, there were things I hadn't let go of. Like how Elara had once been the first person I called when my mother was hospitalized. How she was in the room with me when I bought my wedding dress. How she'd cried when I got engaged. And now thinking back, I couldn't tell if they were real tears or relief that she'd finally gotten close enough to break it all. Grief makes you question every memory you thought was sacred. There were nights I'd wander through antique shops downtown, fingers grazing chipped teacups and tarnished silverware, wondering how many lives had shattered before those pieces ended up on someone's shelf. I wasn't sentimental. I just needed to know I wasn't the only woman who'd been discarded like a seasonal accessory. 2 years in, I'd stopped checking Caleb's LinkedIn. I no longer Googled Elara's name just to see if she was still posting curated brunch photos and thinly veiled inspirational quotes. But I still carried their ghost versions in the back pocket of my mind, like expired ID cards. They didn't hold value anymore, but I wasn't ready to throw them away either. Then during an ethics summit at the Hyatt, I was seated beside a man who didn't introduce himself with a job title or lean too close when I spoke. He just listened. Lucian Drake, the first man in years who didn't make me feel like I was on trial for having survived something. Lucian didn't ask if I was single. He didn't comment on my appearance. He didn't interrupt. He asked about trauma policies and corporate cultures, about burnout cycles, about how leadership changes affect emotional safety for employees. His voice was calm, low, deliberate, like someone who'd already learned what not to say. He spoke like a man who'd seen harm and chosen not to repeat it. We ran into each other again a month later. I was picking up takeout after work Thai food, the kind you eat over the sink when you're too tired to pretend. He was standing behind me in line, holding a dog leash with no dog at the end. "Ruby's in the car," he said when I looked at him. "She likes the AC better than people," I smiled. Can't blame her. That was the beginning. Not of romance, not yet. It was the beginning of stillness, of space, of finding a rhythm with someone who didn't expect me to explain the silences or apologize for the dents in my trust. He invited me to coffee once. I said no. Then I invited him the next week. We sat outside under a striped awning while it rained lightly on the sidewalk. He drank black coffee. I took mine with oat milk and cinnamon. Neither of us talked about our pasts. We just let the air breathe between us. A few months later, he hired me as a consultant for his firm. It was a quiet deal, no HR introduction, no awkward welcome lunch, just a signed contract and an email that said, "Let's build something cleaner this time." That's how Lucian worked. He didn't dazzle. He delivered. I met his daughters 6 months after that. Both teenagers, both suspicious of me as they should have been. But I never tried to charm them. I just showed up, brought snacks to game night, helped with homework when asked, laughed when they rolled their eyes. I never tried to replace anyone. One night, while Lucian and I cleaned up after dinner, he paused at the sink and said, "You don't perform." I looked up. "Should I know," he said with a small smile. "That's the point. I didn't fall in love with Lucian the way you fall from a rooftop. I fell the way people step into the ocean before they can swim, 1 inch at a time. Breath held, wondering if the tide would be gentle or take them under. But the tide held me. If you've ever rebuilt yourself quietly without applause, without anyone noticing until you were already gone, I see you. And maybe your story, like mine, isn't about fighting back. Maybe it's about never letting them know how much they failed to break you. If that's you, you're not alone." Subscribe to Sophia's Revenge Stories for more stories like this. Stories where healing whispers louder than betrayal ever shouted. It was a Tuesday when the envelope arrived. Thin, creamy, elegant, but not expensive. The kind of stationery someone chooses when they want to look refined without spending the money to be it. No return address, no logo. Just my name in Lupian calligraphic script. Juliette Harrow. I almost threw it out. Junk mail in disguise. But something about the handwriting stopped me. Too familiar, too curated. I peeled it open slowly with the back of a butter knife. Inside was a thick, pearl-finished invitation bordered in gold. Elara Quinn and Caleb Harrow. Request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony by the sea. The date was 2 months away. The location, Isle of Palms, just outside Charleston. The town I'd left behind without a word. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was a kind of stunned quiet, like seeing a ghost in broad daylight and wondering if you were the one who died. They were finally getting married. It had been over 5 years since I'd walked out of our shared apartment, since I'd seen either of them in person. I'd stopped checking their social media 2 years ago. I assumed they were already married. Assumed it had happened quickly, quietly, somewhere tropical, with soft lighting and muted guilt. But no, it was now. And they wanted me there. At first I laughed, out loud. The sound echoed in my kitchen, sharp and foreign. Then I stared at the card again. Was it a mistake, a cruel joke, a trap, or was it something else entirely? The question that followed me around all day wasn't, why would they invite me? It was, why do I feel so calm? Because 5 years ago, this would have gutted me. I would have sobbed in the shower, called my therapist, maybe even written a vicious email I'd never send. But now I looked down at the invitation again. The lettering, the formatting, and that's when I saw it. Lucian's name had been handwritten in the same ink beside mine. Elara didn't just know about him. She'd gone out of her way to include him. And I knew instantly this wasn't an olive branch. It was bait. She wanted to see if she still had power, and I wasn't sure whether to laugh again or accept. That night, Lucian found me on the porch, legs curled under me, invitation in one hand and a glass of white wine in the other. He sat beside me without speaking. Eventually, I handed it to him, watched his eyes scan the names, the gold lettering, the date. He let out a low whistle. "That's bold," I smirked. "You have no idea." He studied me for a long moment. "Do you want to go?" "I don't know," I said. "I don't want to make a scene. I don't want to open a wound I've spent years closing." Lucian's voice was steady. "Then don't go for them. Go for you, if you choose to." The next morning I RSVP'd. Yes. The days that followed weren't frantic. There was no revenge plan, no dramatic dress-fitting montage, no anxious pacing in front of a mirror. I didn't need to prove anything. I just wanted to be unmistakably present. I bought the dress on a quiet Thursday afternoon at a boutique tucked between a used bookstore and a consignment wine shop. It was emerald green, deep, soft, clean, not flashy, not bridal, just elegant. The kind of dress that says, "I remember who I am now." Lucian offered to skip it. If this will bring back too much, I understand, but it didn't bring anything back. It brought everything forward. I want to go, I said. Not because I need to see them, but because I'm no longer afraid of being seen. He nodded as he always did, never pushing, never performing. We booked a room at a small high-end inn just outside the wedding venue. Oceanfront, clean linens, balcony with 2 chairs, and just enough distance from the mess I used to call my life. 2 nights before the wedding, I lay awake listening to the tide brush against the shore. I wasn't anxious, I was aware. My body knew what was coming. The way your skin tightens before a storm, not in fear, but in alertness. I remembered the last time I'd seen Caleb. He'd been standing in our shared kitchen, still wearing the watch I'd given him for our 3rd anniversary. Elara had been upstairs pretending she didn't hear the silence. He wouldn't meet my eyes when I said I was leaving, just kept stirring his coffee like he was waiting for someone else to end it. In some ways, I did him a favor. I took the decision out of his hands. And now 5 years later, I was walking back into that same circle, but as someone they couldn't reach anymore. The morning of the wedding, I showered, slowly ran my fingers along the curve of the dress one last time, and stepped into a version of myself I'd spent half a decade building. Lucian helped zip me up, pressed a hand to my waist and whispered, "You don't have to say anything today." I know, I said. That's what makes it powerful. When we arrived, the valet recognized Lucian's name before mine. I didn't mind. The ballroom was everything I expected, over-decorated, underwhelming, performative. Gold linens, white roses, signature cocktails with frosted rims. And then I saw her, Elara, standing near the stage, laughing too loudly, her hand resting possessively on Caleb's arm. She was thinner than I remembered, sharper somehow, like she'd sanded herself down to fit the role. And when she turned and saw us, me and emerald silk Lucian's hand resting on the small of my back, her entire face didn't change. But her eyes did. They froze. And in that one still second, I felt no triumph, no vengeance, no hunger for a scene. I just felt whole. We didn't approach her, not yet. There would be time, but for now I walked slowly toward the bar, with Lucian beside me, each step saying more than I ever could out loud. And for the first time since Charleston, I didn't feel like someone who'd been left behind. I felt like someone who'd simply moved on ahead. The champagne was already flowing when we stepped fully into the reception hall. Strings of warm Edison bulbs looped across the ceiling, trying to mimic intimacy in a room too hollow to hold it. A jazz quartet played near the corner, polished and rehearsed, much like the guests gliding past one another with perfect posture and practiced smiles. We didn't cause a stir, not at first. The hostess barely glanced at the guest list before waving us in, but the murmurs began within minutes. Someone from Caleb's side of the family whispered something into her partner's ear and turned their head just a little too slowly. A former coworker narrowed her eyes like she was trying to place a memory from long ago, one she couldn't quite trust anymore. Lucian remained unreadable beside me, one hand casually in his pocket, the other gently guiding me through the room as though we were walking into an art gallery, not a minefield. "Elara must not know you're here," a voice murmured behind me. I turned. Allison, an old mutual friend who hadn't spoken to me since the divorce. Her hair was sleeker now, her dress tighter, her gaze as sharp as I remembered. "I RSVP'd," I said simply. Her lips parted slightly. "You're brave." "No," I corrected, her eyes steady. "I'm whole." She blinked, hesitated, and gave a small awkward smile before drifting away like smoke. Across the room, Elara finally noticed us again, truly noticed. I saw her spine stiffen beneath that designer gown, the fingers on her champagne flute tightening as Caleb leaned down to say something in her ear. She didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on me. She tried to cover it, of course she did. She turned to greet a cluster of guests, laughed too brightly, touched Caleb's lapel, as if to signal to the room, "I am adored." But her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. We kept our distance. I didn't need to make a scene. I'd already won by simply showing up wearing the life she thought she'd taken from me. Later, as guests were seated for dinner, Lucian stepped away to take a phone call. I stood near the edge of the ballroom watching the servers move like clockwork. That's when Elara appeared beside me. "You came," she said. Her voice was light, but her throat moved as she swallowed. "I did." Her eyes scanned my dress, my hair, the way I held my glass. She always did that inventory before intimacy. "I wasn't sure you'd show," she added, as if that made her brave for inviting me. "I'm not sure you really expected me to," I said quietly, not turning my head. She laughed softly, high-pitched and practiced. "I thought maybe we could start over. A new chapter. Let things go." I faced her then and smiled the kind of smile you give a stranger on a delayed flight. "You go ahead," I said. "I already started mine 5 years ago." A flicker crossed her face, hurt or shame or rage, I couldn't tell. Maybe all three. She said nothing more. Just turned and walked away, her heels clicking a little too quickly across the polished floor. Dinner was a blur of speeches, clinking glassware, and performative laughter. Caleb took the mic first. His voice was steadier than I remembered, but there was something hollow in the way he said thank you. A man who had gained everything but kept checking the door. He spoke of resilience, of the journey of how love finds a way through broken things. I saw him glance in my direction when he said that last part too fast for anyone else to notice. But I saw it, I felt it, like a gust of cold air sneaking under a closed window. Elara's toast came next. She stood tall, radiant in ivory with crystals at the shoulders, looking every bit the bride who had won. But her hands trembled slightly when she raised the flute. She didn't talk about love, not really. She talked about chapters, about timing, about how sometimes the right path includes detours. Her eyes flickered toward me. A veiled barb, a confession only we would understand. The guests clapped. They always clap. They don't know what else to do. After the main course, I stood up and excused myself to the terrace. The ballroom had grown hot, suffocating under the weight of too much pretense. Outside, the sea breeze kissed my arms. The faint scent of salt and peonies carried in the wind. I leaned on the railing, listening to the tide. In the distance, lanterns floated on the waves, each one a tiny, glowing secret. Lucian joined me a few minutes later. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me, eyes on the water. "She's unraveling," I said finally. He didn't ask who I meant. "She's always needed the room to validate her," I continued. "It's never been enough for Elara to be happy. She needs people to watch her happiness." Lucian's voice was calm. "And now she has to watch you, without understanding how you got here. She thinks I came to hurt her," I said. "Did you?" I turned to him. "No, I came to remember that I'm not the one who broke." He nodded. "That's the loudest truth in the room." We stood there a while longer, not speaking. The music inside shifted to something slower. Older, maybe Sinatra, maybe a cover. I didn't care. I wasn't that woman anymore. The one who'd measured her worth by someone else's attention. I turned to go back inside just as a couple passed us on the patio. The woman whispered, not quietly enough, "Is that her?" I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. Yes, I was her. The one they replaced. The one they erased. And now the one they couldn't ignore. Back inside the ballroom, the mood had shifted. The cocktails had begun to loosen tongues, and the glances in our direction were no longer subtle. Whispers trailed behind us like perfume, too faint to catch entirely, but thick enough to sense. Near the dessert table, I caught a voice behind a bouquet of orchids. "Isn't that Lucian Drake?" It wasn't a question. It was confirmation wrapped in curiosity. I turned slightly, just enough to see a bridesmaid in a lavender chiffon dress lean into another guest. Her brows arched high. "He's with her," the other woman replied. I looked down at my glass, giving them nothing. Lucian remained composed, unaffected. But I noticed the widening circles of recognition as word passed quietly through the room. Not just who he was, but what his presence meant. Because this wasn't just about a man showing up to a wedding with a woman from the groom's past. This was Lucian Drake, private investor boardroom legend, the man who'd pulled out of a now infamous startup deal 5 years ago right before Caleb stepped in. A decision that, according to business gossip, had cost Caleb his credibility and most of his liquid capital. I hadn't known all the details at the time. I'd just assumed Caleb's business struggles were personal. But the look in one guest's eyes as he watched Lucian move through the crowd made it clear this was more than personal. This was symbolic. "You're Juliette, right?" a man in a navy suit said, stopping beside me with a cautious smile. "Sorry, I'm Grant Harwood. Used to sit across from Caleb on the Beacon Fun Board." I nodded. "Nice to meet you." He sipped his drink, then gestured slightly toward Lucian. "Didn't expect him here. Hell of a move." I raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" Grant gave a low chuckle. "Drake's firm survived the 2019 bust. Caleb's didn't. Most people don't bring the man who publicly outpaced their husband to the wedding, unless they're sending a message." I smiled but said nothing. Let them guess the message. The ballroom had grown too loud for civility and too quiet for comfort. There was a tension now, not the joyful kind of wedding buzz, but the kind that tightens just beneath the surface where everyone pretends not to be watching. I slipped into the hallway for air, not to escape, just to breathe. Elara found me there, of course. She appeared at the edge of the corridor like she'd been rehearsing it, her hands clasped neatly in front of her lips, pulled into a diplomatic smile. "I didn't want to do this here," she began, stepping closer. "But I think we should clear the air." I didn't respond, so she kept going. "I know you must think I invited you to flaunt something, but I didn't. I invited you because I wanted peace between us. I've grown, Juliette. We both have. And maybe it's time to stop punishing each other." "Punishing?" I tilted my head, studying her. "I'm not punishing anyone, Elara." She blinked. "Well, you showing up with him? Some people might say otherwise." "I didn't bring Lucian to make a point," I said flatly. "I brought him because he's part of my life. That's it." Her smile faltered for just a beat. "He left me, years ago, said I was too ambitious, that I reminded him too much of the people he couldn't trust." It was a story she'd probably told many times, but it landed flat. I didn't need Lucian to deny it. I could see the truth in her eyes. She hadn't processed it. She had simply rebranded it. I didn't need to argue. Elara's narrative always sounded best when she was the victim. "I hope your marriage works," I said, voice calm. "Truly. But I'm not here to relive the past. I'm here because I've made peace with it." That oddly seemed to shake her more than any insult might have. She stared at me, uncertain how to respond, when the script didn't play out the way she'd planned. Just then, Lucian's voice echoed from behind her, calling softly, "Jules." Elara turned at the name, eyes narrowing. He appeared a moment later, holding 2 glasses of champagne. His face didn't flinch when he saw her, just polite, distant. "Elara," he greeted. She straightened her shoulders. "Lucian, I didn't expect to see you again," he said. No anger, no longing, just truth. She said nothing, and for the first time in years, she looked small. Not because she was weaker, but because I was no longer shrinking to make her feel big. Elara retreated soon after, gracefully enough to save face, but not fast enough to hide the way her hands trembled slightly as she walked away. I didn't follow. I had no interest in watching her unravel. Some truths are louder when left unsaid. Lucian handed me one of the glasses. We stood side by side in the hallway, the music from the ballroom drifting faintly through the double doors. "She used to call me every week," he said quietly, after I pulled out of the Halden pitch. Said it was unfair, that I hadn't seen her potential. I looked at him. "You did," he nodded once. "That's why I walked." We didn't speak again for a while. We didn't need to. Eventually, we returned to the ballroom. Dessert had been served, plated cakes with edible flowers untouched on half the tables. A few guests had already started to slip out. The energy had dimmed like a party aging before its time. Then I saw it. Elara's wrist. A bracelet, a slender gold band with 2 green stones embedded on either side of a thin clasp. It wasn't flashy, but I knew it instantly. It had been Lucian's mother's. He'd shown it to me in a box once early on. Said he'd had it custom restored, but hadn't given it to anyone. Said it was meant for someone who'd stay. I froze. Lucian followed my gaze and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I gave that to her once, he said softly. A long time ago, before I understood who she really was. She gave it back the same day I ended things. She must have kept it, I murmured. And now, she's wearing it here. She wants you to see it, he said. Wants me to see it. And I do, he said, then paused. And I feel nothing, that was it, nothing. No anger, no nostalgia, no sting. Just detachment. I turned back to my untouched cake, then pushed the plate gently aside. The music shifted to something upbeat and sincere. A few couples rose to dance. Laughter lifted again, a little too forced. I leaned toward Lucian. What do you do when someone steals something from you, then flaunts it years later, like it still belongs to them? He smiled faintly. You let them. And then he looked at me. Because what they stole was never the real thing. I let that settle for a beat, then nodded. Not everything broken needed fixing. Some things just needed to be seen fully clearly under bright lights and allowed to collapse under their own weight. Do you tell the truth now, or let the truth humiliate them itself? We stayed. After the tension, after the sideways glances, after Elara's faltering speech and Caleb's generic gratitude, we stayed. I watched as guests settled into dessert and conversation, but the pulse of the evening had shifted. Something in the air had thickened, uncertain, uncomfortable, like the collective recognition that a story was unfolding just outside their line of sight, but no one was brave enough to ask who it was about. Lucian and I didn't hide. We didn't perform either. We just remained, present, polished, untouched. The more visible we were, the more invisible they became. As we sat beneath a canopy of fairy lights on the back terrace, Lucian turned toward me with the kind of calm I'd learned to trust, quiet but razor sharp. She kept the bracelet, he said again, not with bitterness, just clarity. She wore it like a trophy. I used to think I'd made her feel special. Now I wonder if she just needed something with a name on it. You left her, I said, and she never stopped needing you to notice her. He nodded, but I didn't leave because she was ambitious. I left because I stopped trusting a single thing she said. That struck something inside me, not because it was new, but because it mirrored exactly what I had never let myself say out loud. Elara didn't break hearts. She rewrote histories. Lucian exhaled, then leaned back against the bench. She thought I'd come back eventually, he said. That's the thing with people like her. They don't believe in endings. They think everyone's just orbiting until they get pulled back in. And yet here we are, I murmured. 2 people she thought she'd erase sitting in plain view. Lucian turned to me, a glint of warmth behind the steadiness. So what do we do? He asked. I smiled, not out of mischief, but something quieter. Certain, nothing, I said. We don't expose. We don't confront. We don't cause a scene. We just exist. We exist in the life they thought we couldn't rebuild. We let them see what peace looks like after them. Lucian tilted his head. You think that's enough? I met his gaze. I think it's everything. And in that moment, we knew this wasn't about revenge. This was about power. And power didn't scream. It walked in silent and composed, and didn't flinch when people turned to look. We didn't need a strategy, just presence. And yet presence, real, self-possessed, grounded, can be the most disarming thing in the world, especially when someone has only ever seen you at your weakest. We returned to the ballroom slowly, not to reclaim anything, but simply to occupy. Our table was near the center prime seating. Elara's wedding planner must have considered it a gesture of peace, or a power move. Either way, it backfired. Because proximity didn't shake us, it shook her. Guests kept approaching Lucian, some out of recognition, others out of curiosity. I watched Caleb watch the calculation in his eyes as he tried to determine how much of the room now belonged to the man who wasn't supposed to be there. Lucian handled it all with the same quiet authority I'd come to admire. Nothing flashy, no posturing, just decisive, intelligent calm. I caught snippets of conversation as people passed. Is he still managing the Veil expansion? I thought he retired. No, wasn't he the one who pulled out before the Halden crash? The subtext was obvious. What is he doing here with her? But they didn't say it aloud, because the answers were visible, because I didn't shrink, because I wasn't looking away, because I was exactly where I wanted to be. I stood near the bar while Lucian spoke with someone from the Charleston Foundation Board. Behind me, I felt a presence approach, measured, reluctant. Elara, again. Her voice was low. I didn't realize you two were serious. I didn't turn. Is that what matters to you? I just didn't expect. She trailed off. That I'd survive. She hesitated. That you'd show up like this. Like what I asked, finally facing her. She looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, like you're winning. I didn't blink. I'm not winning, Elara. I already won, a long time ago, when I stopped waiting for you to be sorry. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I left her there. No cruelty, no threat, just the weight of a truth she could neither carry nor deny. Later, while the party drifted into that last awkward stretch of too much wine and too little sincerity, Lucian and I returned to our table. The candle between us had burned low, flickering in a pool of wax that clung to its base like a secret barely held. Across the room, Caleb looked exhausted, his jacket off collar, loosened brow tense. He wasn't speaking to anyone, not Elara, not the guests, just nursing a glass of something brown and expensive, watching Lucian with the kind of gaze that men wear when they realize they've lost more than they thought they ever could. Lucian leaned in. We could go now, before they unravel further. I shook my head gently. No, his brows lifted slightly. We stay, I said, to the very end. He didn't question it, just sat back, relaxed, comfortable in the choice. Because staying wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about allowing the story to finish itself. There was no need to accelerate the collapse. Their discomfort was doing that all on its own. The next hour passed slowly, like the final stretch of a play, when even the actors know the performance has gone on too long. Elara tried to rally. She posed with friends, adjusted her gown, gave compliments to other women she used to compete with. But her smile never quite landed again. Not after the hallway, not after Lucian, not after me. We danced once, just one song. Lucian's hand warm at my waist, my head resting for a moment against his shoulder as the music wrapped around us. The same way closure wraps around a wound, not to erase it, but to mark that it no longer bleeds. As we danced, I thought of something Lucian had said weeks ago while reading the paper over coffee. People remember the ones who hurt them, he said, but they never forget the ones who made them feel small, just by standing tall. I didn't say anything at the time, but now I understood. There are many kinds of silence. The cruel kind, the scared kind, the exhausted kind. And then there's the kind I carried with me that night. The silence that says, you don't need to see me leave, because I already did, years ago. Would you destroy their party or let your presence ruin them from within? The final toast began just before sunset. The air inside the ballroom had turned dense with perfume, heat, and tension. The lighting dimmed to a golden glow, that carefully staged softness, meant to hide what people didn't want others to see, sweat nerves, broken illusions. I could see Elara preparing herself. She stood behind the head table, shoulders squared, smile too tight. The mic passed from one best man to another bridesmaid, then to Caleb, who stumbled halfway through a joke about how far they'd come and how love sometimes finds us in unexpected places. Lucian's hand found mine under the table, steady, still. Then Elara took the microphone, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stem. The diamonds on her wrist, his bracelet, caught the light, but it no longer shimmered. It glared. She started with pleasantries, thanking the guests, the planners, her parents. She mentioned growth 3 times in the first paragraph, healing once, and then her eyes found mine. Not just once, repeatedly. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't kind, it wasn't envy exactly. It was something stranger, disbelief. As if I had become a version of myself she could neither understand nor compete with. She tried to keep talking, something about starting over, about chapters, but the words began to slow. Lucian shifted slightly beside me, straightening in his chair. Her voice cracked. Not loudly, just enough that every head tilted slightly, every fork paused, every guest leaned forward 1 inch. And she blinked too fast, trying to reset, trying to breathe through whatever realization had started caving in behind her eyes. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just watched her. She knew it too. The way she once watched me unravel back when she still wore her betrayal like silk. Now it was her turn. Not because I took anything from her, but because I had arrived with something she never expected to see again. Peace. Lucian turned to me, eyes soft. She's unraveling. She's realizing, I whispered back. And that's worse. The silence that followed her falter was more telling than any words. People shifted in their seats, exchanging polite smiles edged with uncertainty. A few looked toward Caleb, who stared down at his plate, avoiding the scene unfolding beside him. Elara cleared her throat, tried to smile again, and forced out, "And to everyone here tonight, thank you for believing in our story." But no one clapped. At the back of the room, someone laughed too loud, too late, and clearly unintentional. It echoed just long enough to slice through the tension like a blade. The mic went quiet. Lucian stood slowly, not dramatically, just calmly, as if to anchor the moment in something solid. He extended his hand to me and I rose, adjusting my dress in one smooth motion. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. As we walked toward the edge of the room, simply to step outside, nothing more. Elara's gaze followed us the entire way. Her mouth opened once as if she wanted to say something, call out maybe, but she didn't. She couldn't. We passed a group of older guests near the bar. One woman leaned over to a man in a navy blazer and murmured just loud enough, "You two look like the couple everyone hoped for 6 years ago." Lucian heard it. So did I. He didn't react. I offered a single quiet smile as we passed. Moments later, we stepped out into the evening air. The sky had shifted into that soft twilight blue that feels like forgiveness. The ocean just beyond the hedges murmured with each rolling wave. I inhaled deeply. Not relief, not victory, just clarity. Then I heard it behind me, Caleb's voice, too slurred to be deliberate, too honest to be accidental. "Guess he always liked you better." I turned slowly. He was leaning against one of the terrace columns, glass in hand. Bow tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. His words hung between us like condensation, visible but doomed to vanish. Elara stood a few feet behind him, frozen. I didn't say a word. Lucian stepped beside me again, his hand resting gently at my waist. No one moved. No one needed to. The only thing louder than Caleb's confession was the sound of everything Elara had tried to build, cracking, not loudly, but visibly, irrevocably. Inside, the music resumed a little too cheerful, like someone trying to laugh through a funeral. Guests returned to their tables, but the energy was gone. The story had shifted, and everyone knew it. Not because anyone declared it, but because truth rarely needs a spotlight. It just arrives. Elara remained near the edge of the room, her posture stiff, her eyes no longer scanning for admiration, but for control, and finding none. She never finished her speech. She didn't have to. Everyone had seen enough. Lucian and I stood near the railing, bathed in soft amber light from the terrace sconces. For a moment, I thought of the woman I'd once been, the one who would have crumbled under the same gaze Elara now wore. But I didn't crumble. I stood, not out of defiance, but because this moment didn't belong to me. It belonged to the version of me who once believed betrayal meant the end, and now she knew better. Elara stepped outside minutes later, not toward us, just out. As if she couldn't stand the room anymore, she stared out toward the dark line where the ocean met the sky. I wondered if she realized she had spent all this time trying to win a story I no longer participated in. "Would you go back in?" Lucian asked gently. "No," I replied. "She's already surrounded. I'm not needed." He nodded. We stayed there until the sounds inside softened, then died. Someone gave a half-hearted toast. Someone else dropped a glass. It wasn't dramatic, just deflated. When we finally turned to leave, I didn't look back. Not once. Because when a chapter is over, the paper starts to curl at the edges whether or not you write the end. Is it justice? If you never raised your voice to deliver it. Savannah smelled like honeysuckle again. The morning after we returned, I opened the windows of our brownstone and let the breeze in. The air was warm and sweet, carrying the faint chatter of a nearby market and the whistle of someone walking their dog past our gate. No chandeliers, no whispers, no forced smiles, just life unfolding exactly as it should. Lucian was in the living room, curled into the corner of the sofa, barefoot, reading an old paperback with a pen resting behind his ear. His glasses had slipped halfway down his nose, and a half-empty cup of black coffee sat on the table beside him. I watched him for a moment, memorizing the stillness. It wasn't that kind of stillness you escape into. It was the kind you build. I checked my phone once that day. One message, from a number I hadn't saved but one I recognized without hesitation. "I saw you. No punctuation, no explanation, no apology, just 3 words. I stared at it longer than I should have. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I finally knew I didn't need to say anything at all. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I let it sit there, like a paperweight on a letter I would never open. That night I opened my journal, the same leather-bound one I'd started 4 years earlier when the grief had nowhere else to land. I flipped past pages filled with doubt-fury and self-doubt dressed up as strength, until I found a blank page. And I wrote I didn't punish her, I didn't confront her, I didn't shame her, I just let her see that I was alive and that her absence had become irrelevant. That was enough. I closed the journal, gently placed it back on the shelf. Then I went into the kitchen. Lucian had baked. The scent of apple and cinnamon drifted into the hallway, wrapping around the corners of the house like a soft sweater. Jazz played low on the stereo, Ella Fitzgerald maybe. His daughters would be home later that evening. I'd already set out the board games they liked. The laundry was humming in the background, and I'd forgotten all about the mess of last week. That was the point. Peace wasn't a performance. It was a decision made in quiet moments like these. I poured 2 cups of tea, and as I walked toward the living room, Lucian looked up and smiled. The kind of smile that says you're safe now. You made it. And I believed him. For the first time in years, I believed I had made it. Later that evening, as twilight settled over Savannah in its slow golden way, we sat together on the back patio. Fireflies blinked along the edge of the fence, and the crepe myrtles swayed softly overhead. Lucian rested his hand over mine, not to comfort, not to reassure, just to be there, present. The quiet wasn't heavy, it was earned. I thought about the wedding, about the way Elara looked at me, the way Caleb said what he wasn't supposed to say, the way no one stood up for them, not because they didn't care, but because they finally saw everything for what it was. I thought about the girl I used to be. She would have begged for closure, would have written a long email, would have stayed up late analyzing every look, every pause, every unspoken insult. She would have mistaken silence for defeat. But I wasn't her anymore. Now silence felt like a line I'd drawn not around me, but between me and who I refused to become. I stood from the patio chair and walked barefoot back into the house. The kitchen still smelled like apples and nutmeg. Our dog Clover was curled at the foot of the stairs. The books on the coffee table were messy, but I liked them that way. Lucian followed a moment later, setting down his glass. "You okay?" I nodded. "Better than okay." He pulled me into his arms, and we swayed a little to music that wasn't playing. I whispered into his chest. I used to think I needed revenge to be free. And now I leaned back, met his eyes, and said, "Now I know I just needed to stop needing them to see me suffer." He kissed my forehead. That's real freedom. I sat down at my desk later that night, opened a new page in my journal. She thought I'd show up to hurt her, but I only showed her I could live. Not louder, just longer, not to win, just to prove I didn't lose myself. I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around. The picture frames were all filled now, not with staged memories or curated perfection, but with now, with what was left when the performance ended and the healing stayed. In the distance, the dishwasher beeped. The dog sighed. A breeze tapped gently at the window, and I smiled, not because I'd won, but because I hadn't lost myself trying to. Have you ever let your silence be the loudest truth in the room? Share your story. And if you felt this one in your bones, subscribe to Sophia's Revenge Stories for more stories that speak the truths we never got to say out loud. What would Sophia do next? You tell us.